clarify that name for me?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the most important event of the evening is that this morning I did a radio interview and somebody gave me 2 tickets to Earth, Wind, and Fire tonight. So I have 1 ticket and no transportation. So if anyone wants to go to Earth, Wind, and Fire, see me afterwards. I'm serious. I'll go. If I can find a driver, will drive me back to Portland when we're done. I spent 20 years of my life as a war correspondent in the Balkans, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. Started with the wars in El Salvador in the early 1980s and ended in Sarajevo and Kosovo. I don't do that anymore. It took me a good 2 or 3 years after I stopped to pull myself back together. Anyone who has experienced repeated and severe trauma and exposure to trauma understands exactly that long recovery process. But I know the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, spent 7 years in the Middle East, a lot of that time in Iraq. I'm an Arabic speaker, had 600 hours of Arabic. And I get war. I know the instrument of war. I know how it works. I know various types of war. I know what particular weapons systems are capable of doing. And one of the great frustrations, I was in the build-up to this war, I had my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, had come out. That was the fall of 2002. And inevitably I would be asked as on the book tour, which was extensive because, of course, it was unbeknownst to me when I began the book, had become extremely topical. I didn't know when I began writing the book that we were going to actually the country was going to be propelled forward into an invasion and occupation. And I would be asked about the arguments put forward by the Bush administration and, frankly, almost everyone universally all across the political spectrum for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. If you remember, even people like David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, coined the term reluctant hawk. There were very, very few dissenters, certainly within the mainstream. I'm well aware on the grassroots that there were dissenters. But among the sort of chattering classes, there weren't many. And but I think if you took, let's say, the roughly 10,000 Arabists in this country, and by that I mean people who have lived for a prolonged period of time in the Middle East and speak Arabic, I don't think you could have found more than a dozen that thought invading and occupying Iraq was a good idea. And I include all the Arabists in the State Department, the intelligence community, and the Pentagon. The idea that the democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, the idea that we would be greeted as liberators, the idea that the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction of Iraq were utopian, and utopian in the Thomas More sense of the word. He coined the word 1518. It literally means no place. I'm deeply anti-utopian. I wrote a book called I Don't Believe in Atheists, which is really going after utopians who use the language of scientific rationalism. I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right with the title American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. Utopian movements, when wedded to violence, always descend into criminality and moral depravity, which of course is exactly what the war has become. I think many of us don't think of Dick Cheney as a utopian, but he is. In this sense, he is a utopian, because the vision that they had of an occupied Iraq had no connection to reality. And now we hear this same kind of utopian folly spun out to justify airstrikes against Iran, something those of us who follow the Middle East are absolutely terrified about. The consequences of that, which are not the subject of this talk, are truly catastrophic. I mean, there is a potential for an Armageddon-type scenario regionally within the Middle East if they go ahead with this, or if they allow Israel to go ahead with it. And there is certainly increasing possibility. I just did an event with Seymour Hersh, who's about to come out with an article about this in the New Yorker, and we are all very, very concerned that the Bush administration, which remains lethal until midnight, January 19th of 2009, it may very well, they may not be done. The occupation of Iraq fits a particular pattern of a type of war. There's probably many types of war, but there's roughly three types of wars that I've been involved in. One is the conflicts in Central America, which were essentially civil wars. You had an insurgency, but it was Salvadoran against Salvadoran. It was Guatemalan against Guatemalan. And then you have, which we see less and less of, and we probably will see less of in the future, conventional warfare between large mechanized armies. That was the first Gulf War. I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. And then after that was in the Shiite uprising in Basra until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard. Now, I'm certainly not blind to the heavy loss of civilian life in southern Iraq because of the aerial bombing. But the actual clash between opposing forces was largely mechanized and took place in open desert where there were few civilians. The third type of war, which is characteristic of the war in Iraq, is the most venal and the dirtiest type of war, and that is foreign occupation, where foreign forces go in to a country where they don't speak the language, they're culturally, socially, historically illiterate, and they attempt to impose their will by force. They speak exclusively in the language of force. This kind of conflict we see played out with the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. We saw it played out in Vietnam. We saw it played out with the French in Algeria. And these wars, I think, are the messiest, dirtiest, and most brutal because you have foreign forces, such as American forces in Iraq, that are fighting an elusive enemy who they can't see. And they are attempting to combat this enemy in an openly hostile population. You know, the latest polls on Iraq estimate that 1% of Iraqis want Americans in the country. And Robert J. Lifton, the great psychiatrist, wrote, when he wrote about the Vietnam War and the psychological damage done to veterans and in the war, he coined the term atrocity-producing situations to explain these types of conflicts. Atrocity-producing situations, he said, are situations where there is a short psychological leap from viewing everyone around you as hostile to viewing everyone around you as the enemy, and therefore, since they are the enemy, armed or unarmed, they become legitimate targets, especially after your unit has suffered casualties or fatalities. You know, one of the things about an insurgency, and this was true, I was 5 years covering the war in El Salvador, I can only remember once, and this was a low-intensity conflict, I only remember once ever seeing someone who was shooting at me. I certainly was in ambushes and was in combat, but you very, very rarely see the person who's pulling the trigger. In Iraq, soldiers and Marines can go through an entire deployment and never actually see the people who are attacking them, especially with the heavy use of IEDs or improvised explosive devices. In these kinds of conflicts where you lash out and the occupation forces are allowed to use weapons that should never be used in densely populated areas. These are belt-fed saws. They're light machine guns, 7.62 machine guns mounted on the tops of Humvees, automatic grenade launchers, even 50 caliber machine guns. And when you lay down that kind of suppressing fire to in the face of what you determine might be a threat or even as an active threat, you have severe loss of life among civilians who are crowded into this area and inevitably are going to be caught up in the indiscriminate use of firepower to essentially ward off any further attacks. Now, this is very common phenomena, as veterans told us, especially after an IED goes off. You just lay down on either side of the road, a withering, you rake either side of the road with automatic fire. They very rarely, almost never stop to examine the consequences of these bursts of fire. And we now are at a situation with the war in Iraq where the estimates of Iraqi civilian dead range from credible studies, beginning with the Lancet study, between 600,000 and 1.2 million Iraqi dead. Murder is part of every war I ever covered. Murder being the taking of a life of someone who does not have the capacity to harm you. Killing is also, of course, part of war, the taking of a life of somebody who does have the capacity to harm you. But in these kinds of conflicts, there is very little killing. They are primarily about murder. And this reality of the war is one that even for those of us who oppose the war is just too unpalatable. It flies in the face of this sort of faux heroism that we extend to anyone who serves in Iraq. It challenges our own conception of ourselves as a good and decent and virtuous and moral people. And so it's covered up. And it's covered up so that we can imbibe the myth of war, something I write a lot about in War as a Force that gives us meaning, and is not certainly exposed to much of the rest of the world, but not exposed by our own media to us. Now, at this point, that's not completely the fault of the American press. The situation, the security situation in Iraq is severe. I know that from friends of mine who are there that when they leave, essentially their small fortified compounds where journalists live, they will never stay in any one place for more than 20 minutes. They themselves travel in armored cars, as we did in Bosnia, and with bodyguards, security details. It is impossible to spend prolonged periods of time in civilian populations and villages and neighborhoods and collect the kind of testimony that would expose the reality of war. You can never understand war unless you see war through the eyes of the victims. In a war zone, only a small percentage, 1 or 2% of the people are actually armed. And the division between those who are all powerful, who have the godlike power to revoke another person's charter to live on this planet, and those who are powerless, completely powerless, is cavernous. There is no middle ground in war. And that's why I think that often the best war novels are written by women, because in most war situations, women are not invited into that seductive embrace of violence, just as I think the best war movies are movies that eschew images of violence, because there is always a prurient fascination and an identification, even unconscious, with those who wield the weapons. I give you two great examples. One would be Elsa Morante's, the Italian novelist's great work, History, a novel about a single mother in occupied Rome. The other would be René Clément's great film, Le Jeu Interdit, Hidden Games, 1950, which has a very brief scene of a German plane strafing a column of French refugees, and the rest of the movie is about two children. A little girl's parents are both killed in the strafing attack, and they spend the entire movie burying things. They create small cemeteries for pets and animals because, of course, the one thing she understands is that her parents have been buried. He captures the strange and dark pathology of war, the essence of war, which is death, war is our collective form of necrophilia. I wanted to know, I tried to figure out how to come in through the back door and write about the reality of the war for an American public that I felt had very little understanding of what this war meant if you were an Iraqi civilian. And I thought back to the great documentary film, Winter Soldier, filmed in Detroit, 1971, when very courageous Vietnam veterans went before the cameras and in gut-wrenching, emotional detail explained the atrocities that they had witnessed or taken part in. And I approached the editor of The Nation magazine, Katrina vanden Heuvel, and suggested that with another reporter, Laila Al-Arian, we set out to see if we could find veterans from this war who could find within them the moral courage to speak the truth about the war. Physical courage is something I often saw on a battlefield. Moral courage I almost never saw. Moral courage requires you to stand up against your comrades. That pull of comradeship is a powerful pull. It's not friendship. It looks and feels like friendship. It's the opposite of friendship. And working through groups like Iraqi Veterans Against the War, although not everyone we interviewed was against the war. And interestingly enough, focusing primarily on lower-ranking soldiers and Marines, in part because, of course, they're the ones always out in the street. The higher you get up in the food chain, the less they go out and expose themselves to real risk. Over 7 months, we interviewed 50 combat veterans, all on the record. I insisted that it be on the record. If people did not want to speak on the record, we didn't do the interview. Everything was taped. We typed up all the transcripts of the interviews, hundreds of pages, and I wasn't going to sort of just splatter these transcripts into the book. You can see it's a fairly thin book. I wanted to keep it very tightly focused on what I considered to be the pillars of the occupation: convoys, detentions, raids, checkpoints, the propaganda war, Hearts and Minds, which ended up really being a story about the racism, the endemic dehumanization that takes place within the military even before soldiers and Marines are deployed in theater. They would talk about the language they used to denigrate and dehumanize the Iraqis who they were about to, whose country they were about to enter and control. The flashpoints for most Iraqis, are the flashpoints for most Iraqis. They are sort of the meat grinders for human life. Convoys, for instance. You can't be static in Iraq. It's too dangerous. If your convoy gets stalled at an intersection, even if an IED doesn't go off, you can be sure that the next time it's stalled, your convoy is stalled, it will go off. And so convoys in Iraq have become little more than freight trains of death, barreling through Iraqi villages, towns, and cities at 50 or 60 miles an hour, jumping meridians, plowing into oncoming traffic, smashing into Iraqi vehicles, and running over Iraqi civilians, including children. This is in the book, many of these veterans talked about being told the rules of engagement for convoys before they were deployed in Kuwait, and they were repeatedly told never to stop, that stopping risked your entire unit, and if a 10-year-old boy or girl wandered out in front of your convoy, they were to be run over, and they are run over. Convoys become most deadly, of course, when they come under attack, either from an IED or from small arms fire, and then, of course, the heavy weaponry that is deployed in these convoys are unleashed on either side of the road with almost no investigation into the consequences. One of the things that veterans told us was that their units usually carried what they call throwaways, which were rusty AK-47s or shovels, and if there was a a significant number of civilian dead and a potential for an investigation, they would toss these weapons among the bodies or the shovels. Shovels, of course, are used to dig holes on the side of the road to plant IEDs so that anyone carrying a shovel, anyone seen with a shovel on the side of the road is almost always automatically shot and killed, even if they're just tending their garden in Iraq. They would take pictures of this to justify, another sort of indiscriminate attack against Iraqi civilians. Checkpoints, of course, are also exceedingly dangerous for Iraqi civilians. Most checkpoints are not fixed. They're flying checkpoints. That's the term they use. They're put up very quickly, often for a few hours, so that you can be driving in your neighborhood or a part of the city. You turn a corner, there's never been a checkpoint. Suddenly there is a checkpoint. It's dusk. You're going a little too fast. The brakes are not good on your car, and your car is riddled with automatic fire. We have this was just almost a daily occurrence, numerous stories of this. And in some cases, whole families would be killed and they would be left on the side of the road in the car, their bodies sort of decaying for 2 or 3 days before somebody came and towed them away. One of the other things that is exceedingly precarious for Iraqis is that as part of an effort to sort of provide better security, American checkpoints will sometimes put Iraqi soldiers a couple hundred yards down the road so that they have to pass through that checkpoint first. Now, if you're, let's say, a Sunni in a Shiite neighborhood and you turn a corner and see a bunch of Iraqis in a military uniform, you may not want to stop. You may not want to stop because the Ministry of Interior in Iraq runs death squads, which is Shiite-dominated. You may not want to stop because of the kidnapping and criminal gangs who may pull you from your car and hold you for ransom. And you may just decide that it's better to try and gun it, either to reverse or to maybe even shoot your way through a checkpoint, and oftentimes not knowing that beyond that checkpoint there are American units who, if they see a car coming to them at an accelerated rate of speed, will of course pepper it with automatic fire. Raids are also one of the fundamental tools used to maintain the occupation. After an attack takes place, it's very common that at a village or a neighborhood or an area, a populated area where the IED went off or where the automatic fire came from, will be cordoned off at 2 in the morning. Soldiers and Marines will burst into homes, their safety's off, their weapons ready. You can imagine the terror unleashed on a family. They will ransack the home, ripping open with K-bar knives, cushions, overturning refrigerators. Also, we were told there's a lot of theft. Any type of valuables, gold, money is often taken. Men of military age are usually herded into one room in the house. They are handcuffed with plastic handcuffs behind their backs and usually transported into the labyrinth of the Iraqi prison system. We're not the only people who torture Iraqis in Iraq. The Iraqis who run the prison system are also very competent torturers, and people, men of military age who have done nothing, can disappear for months, sometimes years, as their family goes from prison to prison in the desperate effort to find out the fate and location of their loved ones. The net result is that the various tools that we use to solidify control are the best and most potent recruiting weapon that the insurgents have. It breaks every single rule of counterinsurgency warfare, and I learned a lot about counterinsurgency warfare in the war in El Salvador, which was run by the United States, the counterinsurgency program, primarily by people who had learned the lesson in Vietnam. The head of the counterinsurgency program, when I was in El Salvador, had been the deputy head of the Phoenix program. A friend of mine and another journalist and I once got the phone list for the embassy, and 60% of the embassy staff had exactly the same phone extension, so you can guess who they were working for. But they understood, and it was, the rightness and wrongness of it I won't debate tonight, but they broke the back of the rebel movement in El Salvador, and they broke it through very astute counterinsurgency tactics. One of the keys was shutting down the death squads, which when I arrived in El Salvador were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month, and they realized that the death squads were the greatest recruiting weapon that the FMLN had. They organized Salvadoran units into competent combat battalions. Helicopters played a huge part, air power. January of 1984, Reagan sent down 70 Huey helicopters. The whole nature of the war changed. And then they also realized that they would have to make political sacrifices in order to woo 50% of Salvadorans were landless people back into the fold. That gave them Napoleon Duarte, land reform. There's a fascinating incident that I think illustrates the astuteness of the counterinsurgency campaign. When I was there, 4 U.S. Marines were assassinated at an outdoor cafe in a place called the Zona Rosa in San Salvador, and Reagan wanted to send U.S. planes to bomb the northern province of Morazan, which was a rebel stronghold, and the people running the war stopped them because they knew precisely that kind of overt attack on Salvadorans, as it would on any country, would only swell the anger and rage of those who felt that their country was being intervened. So it was a war of shadows, an astute war, an interesting war. I've always thought one day when I had enough money, because I can't imagine who'd read it, I'd go back and write about it. And you watch every one of these tenets being violated in the war in Iraq. So after gathering these interviews and testimonies, many of which were deep, most of which were very emotional. I mean, I think a vast majority of the people we interviewed at certain points during the interview broke down. I'm not into, the emotional pornography of television news. That's when I turned my tape recorder off until people were composed. This was a story of the war. It wasn't a story of the pain that these veterans have undergone and are undergoing. But I really walk away with tremendous respect for what these people did and the courage they had to stand up and speak the truth. In many of these stories, it's deeply self-incriminating. I mean, we have stories in there of people who confess to shooting young children and killing them. And we ran, after 7 months of this, we ran it in The Nation magazine, which, and the book is really an extension of that article. It was called The Other War. It ran a year ago. The great photographer Eugene Richards did the photographs, which are replicated or reprinted in the book. And when he went out to shoot the veterans, he said, all I wanted was their eyes. And if you look at the photographs, he, I think, captured quite poignantly the terrible pain and distance that these maimed, emotionally maimed, in some cases physically maimed individuals have undergone because of their experience in Iraq. I had no illusion that anybody, that this huge investigation was going to be picked up by the mainstream press, which still thrives on this mythic narrative of heroism and honor and glory and heroism, all these abstract words that in a moment of combat are rendered hollow and usually obscene. Winter Soldier had huge repercussions in 1971 when it came out in Europe and was virtually ignored in the United States. So when the article came out, we had a few of the pro-war groups attempt to go after us, but we had them because everything was on the record and everything was taped. And so the best they could say was that things were taken out of context, and our response, because we had the transcripts, was essentially to post the transcripts of those interviews on the Nation website. Bob Herbert wrote a column. NBC came and interviewed some of the veterans and myself. It never aired. Otherwise, it was ignored. In Europe, it was a gigantic story. The Guardian newspaper in London reprinted the entire 15,000 words. The Independent led the paper with it, and if didn't print quite 15,000, but probably 7,000 or 8,000, which is a staggering amount of space in newsprint. The BBC ran with it, Irish Times, Irish Radio, and here, nothing. Nothing. It was when those people whose job it is to defend and promote this war realized that trying to run into the article was like running into a brick wall. They essentially walked away from it and pretended it didn't exist. One of the other things we did was after we did the interviews, we went to the Pentagon and verified every single service record so that if someone told us that they were in Fallujah in February of 2004, we found out that they really were in Fallujah in 2004. The New York Times, if you remember, got burned by this in the magazine by a woman who said she was in Iraq when she wasn't. I was on the investigative team of the New York Times. I covered Al-Qaeda, based in Paris in Europe and North Africa, and you learn as an investigative reporter that you can't make one mistake. Because if you make one mistake, that's all they'll talk about, to discredit your entire story. And unfortunately, in investigative journalism, you throw out a lot of great stuff because if it's not bulletproof, you can't print it. So when we finished the piece and we decided, given the fact that we had such extensive material, that we would build around the framework of the magazine article and put it out into a book as a kind of public document, as a counter-narrative to the war, and that is what led to the publication of Collateral Damage and has brought me here tonight. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to independent journalist and author Chris Hedges talking about his latest book, co-authored with Laila Al-Arian, Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. In a moment, we'll return to questions from the audience. Chris Hedges is an award-winning journalist and author whose work has appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, Foreign Affairs, Harper's Magazine, the New York Review of Books, and The Nation magazine. His books include War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, What Every Person Should Know About War, Losing Moses on the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, I Don't Believe in Atheists, and his latest, co-authored with Laila Al-Arian, Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. And now we return to the question and answer segment of the program. You're listening to journalist and author Chris Hedges. He spoke at Powell's City of Books in Beaverton, Oregon, on Friday, June 27, 2008. The first question for Chris Hedges was whether this was the first book he had done with a co-author. What role did his co-author play? And how did it work, having a co-author?
It was the first book I did with a co-author. The role she played was that she did a lot of the research. And, a lot of authors have people who do research, and then their name sort of appears, at the bottom of their acknowledgments. She did so much work, it wasn't fair. The final write-through I did, it's a dry book. I mean, it's not, I'm a writer and I'm a bit of a stylist and I write and rewrite and love to write. But this book is pretty stark, and we really leaned very heavily on the verbatim testimony. I mean, one of the things I sort of like about the book is that we didn't clean it up. If you work for the New York Times and you interview someone, by the time it's in print, everyone you interview in the New York Times looks like they graduated from Princeton. All the grammar is correct, and people don't speak like that. And especially, 18-year-old kids from Mississippi, or don't speak like that. And so we recreated, I mean, we really stuck to the transcripts really closely, and I think it gives the narrative a kind of authenticity. But she did a tremendous amount of work. Logistically, it was really tough. It was tough to find people to speak. And we usually did it by, we would finish an interview, and after this long, exhaustive process, sometimes we'd go back 2 or 3 times, they would then call a friend in, Colorado, and it was because they got a call from their buddy that they would agree to speak with us. I don't really like working with co-authors. I mean, I think in this book it worked because it's a peculiar type of endeavor, which is skewed much more to investigative type of, one of the reasons I don't like being an investigative reporter is that by the time you print anything, it looks like a legal brief. There's no room for good writing. And it's just really time-consuming and really tedious. I mean, it's hours and hours and hours for minutia and small facts. But yeah, this is the first time.
The next audience member asked how many people the authors had to talk to get the 50 that they ended up using in the book.
Well, that's a good question. I would say we probably talked to 100 people, and maybe 50 for whatever reason didn't work or didn't want to talk, or we sent out mass. We got the Iraqi Veterans Against the War, and we got another veterans organization, which is pretty right wing, Paul Rykoff's group, to actually send out mass emails explaining what we wanted to do. We were very clear from the beginning that this was not a war about, not an article about what Iraqi vets are undergoing, and it was an article that was about Iraqi civilians. But yeah, I would guess about 100.
The next question was about the high rate of suicides among Iraq veterans. Have either of the authors followed up with the veterans you spoke with about the potential risks of suicide?
As far as I know, none of the people that we interviewed have killed themselves. Some of them, when we interviewed them, had tried to kill themselves. Some of them, a couple of the vets were homeless. Some of these vets are really in tough shape because they go through the trauma and then they're redeployed, so they're re-traumatized 2 or 3 times. There are some really damaged kids out there. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the suicide rate among Iraqi vets went up 13% this year. 115 suicides. Right.
The next question asked about the author's description of the U.S. in El Salvador as having run a brilliant counterinsurgency. Why has the U.S. counterinsurgency in Iraq been run so incompetently and been strung out for so long?
Because the people who... Why is this, if the Salvadoran counterinsurgency was run brilliantly, which were my words, why is this one so incompetent? Because we have elected incompetent people to run our country. George Bush is the worst president in American history. And the people around him are, a lot of them were in the Reagan administration and involved in Central America when I was there. But they were really lunatics. People like Elliot Abrams. He's certifiably insane. He knows nothing about Central America, and he knows nothing about the Middle East. And he's sitting in the National Security Council, drawing up acquisition hits for Iran. I mean, these people are really whacked out. People like Pearl and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Cheney. I mean, they are frightening, frightening figures. And I think that we, sometimes don't grasp how radical they are. They are truly radical, and how unbalanced they are. They are messianic, utopian, figures who believe in massive acts of violence to reform the world to their vision.
The next question for Chris Hedges asked him to explain why there are so few journalists doing this kind of reporting and writing about the war in Iraq.
Well, because she's asking about the press and why there are so few of us who are willing to, and she mentions, several friends and people I admire, Robert Scheer, Jeremy Scahill, Cy Hirsch, you would add to that list, Amy Goodman. Because when I began in this business, there was room for people like me. and the parameters of the business narrowed. You know, I left the New York Times over the Iraq War. I had been denouncing the war and gave a commencement address in the spring of 2003 at Rockford College in Rockford, Illinois, where I got up and denounced the war and was booed off of the commencement stage. My microphone was cut twice. Large sections of the crowd, several hundred people, got up and began singing "God Bless America," weeping. Granta magazine in Britain published a transcript of the commencement address, but what's interesting is that in italics they printed what people shouted at me, my favorite being "atheist stranger." And I was escorted by campus security off the platform before the awarding of diplomas. The paper, the Rockford Register, the next day, the front page headline was "Rockford College Graduation Speaker Disrupts Graduation." This, of course, got picked up, home video, Fox, CNN, they had a field day with it. The Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial denouncing me. O'Reilly, bashed me for several days. And I was called in and given a formal written reprimand from the New York Times for impugning the impartiality of the newspaper. I'd been there 15 years. I'd won the Pulitzer for them the year before. And I was faced with a choice. I could muzzle myself and pay fealty to my career, or I could walk away, and I walked away. But I think part of the reason that there are so few is because the consequences are grave. Robert Scheer, 30 years with the LA Times, brilliant, courageous writer, columnist, in column after column attacked the folly of going into Iraq, and the publisher fired him. All of the people who sold you the war are still up there. All those pundits are still there. And the few people who got it right were pushed to the margins and remain on the margins. And that's the cost. But, I never went to journalism school. I went to seminary. I graduated from seminary, and as my close friend Stephen Kinzer reminds me, I'm not really a journalist. I'm just a minister pretending to be a journalist.
The next question from the audience asked about how many Iraqi civilian voices were included in the book, and what went into the choice of including or not including Iraqis.
There are no voices of Iraqi civilians because, as an American reporter, it's impossible to go out and get in significant volume those voices. It's too dangerous. We will get those voices one day. And there are foreign news outlets like Al Jazeera, which remained in Fallujah with civilians as the Marines were literally leveling the city. But that you can't see Al Jazeera here. That's not an accident. So it was really a way, as I said at the beginning, to go through the back door. Yes, obviously, the best is to get Iraqi civilian voices, but if that's not possible, then let's at least find those veterans who have the moral courage to stand up and speak the truth about the war and give them a platform.
The next audience member asked about the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq. What was the strategy before the so-called surge, and what has the strategy been after the surge?
Well, the counterinsurgency strategy, Petraeus wrote the manual, but it's folly. The strategy, the real strategy, is that they have bought off the Sunni insurgents, the so-called awakening militias. There are 80,000 now. And these people have a lot of American blood on their hands and a lot of Shiite blood as well, who are paid salaries of $300 a month and allowed to constitute themselves as a conventional military force. But we don't own these people. We rent them. That's seen a significant diminishing of the violence. But it's a short-term tactic that will backfire on us in very big ways, because the Sunnis under Saddam Hussein, who constitute a minority in Iraq, made up the officer corps. They made up all of the intelligence services. They constituted all of the special forces, elite units. They have the expertise and the wherewithal to create a conventional military force with tremendous potency, and that's what we are allowing them to do. We have allowed them to ethnically cleanse and take control of essentially fiefdoms not only within Baghdad but within Iraq. They have no loyalty to the central government. In fact, they're openly hostile to the Shiite-dominated government, the weak government that they would like to overthrow. We tried the same tactic in Afghanistan, where we bought off with money and weapons tribal groups, and as soon as the money and weapons stopped, they went right back into the arms of the Taliban. So it is a pact with the devil, and it is one we will come to deeply regret as soon as it collapses. But it has allowed them to buy a kind of respite. If you remember, on the eve of this, we had these massive car bombs going off in Baghdad with like 200 dead. They were able to stop that. But this policy will come back to haunt us in big ways.
The next question for Chris Hedges is about the way reporters have been embedded with military units in Iraq, and other ways that their reporting is influenced and controlled abroad and domestically. Can you comment on that part of news reporting here in the United States?
She's talking about the way the press is controlled. Well, we live in a corporate state, and with the rise of a corporate state always comes the rise of a surveillance state. The FISA bill is a huge leap towards fascism. If you look at it closely, I'm one of the ACLU plaintiffs, along with Naomi Klein and a few other people who will be filing with the ACLU a lawsuit as soon as Bush, which looks like around July 9th, once the Senate passes this bill, signs this bill into law. This is an absolutely disastrous bill, especially for those of us who have regular contact with people overseas and in the Middle East, because what it does is essentially, shut down the possibility of whistleblowers, dissidents, people who have information or facts or material that counters the official government narrative. It is really, really frightening. We know from the whistleblower in San Francisco that they've downloaded tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of our emails, our web browsing, our phone records. All of these things are stored. All of these things can be shared with a foreign government. And, Frank Church understood this in an investigation of the National Security Agency in 1975, and at the end he issued this sort of statement. I quoted it. I gave George Bush gave a commencement address at Furman College in South Carolina this spring, and they invited me down to give the alternative commencement address. And so if you type in Furman College, my name, you can find that quote. But Church says, in essence, that, oh my God, if the technological capacity of this agency is so massive that should it ever be unleashed against American civilians, it would absolutely silence any form of dissent and turn us into a totalitarian state. I mean, those are almost exactly his words. And of course, now the NSA is allowed to carry out domestic spying. The control, and it's not that you don't have people of conscience. I mean, I spent a long time at the New York Times, but they're frightened. They know the consequences of standing up, and you get punished. You get pushed out, and people, it's about job. Look, when I left the paper, it was not a happy moment. I didn't have any money. I didn't know what I was going to do. It was a really unnerving moment. I actually thought I was going to go teach high school, which I wouldn't have minded doing. I mean, that's a noble profession, but I didn't know. And I was fortunate in having a father who was an activist. He was very involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the gay rights movement. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and 60s, so that in the 1970s, my dad was running around calling for the ordination and marriage of gays. I went to undergraduate at Colgate. By then, my father had a church in Syracuse. He was constantly being thrown out of churches, congregations walking out on him, as you can imagine. And but it was a great lesson for me as a kid, because I realized don't be naive and think that anybody's ever going to reward you for virtue. That's the price of the moral life. It is its own reward. But in terms of how the world defines success, you're going to be a failure. And that model was one. When I got called into the New York Times, I realized that I had a choice at that moment between promoting my career, but to do so would be to betray my dad, which I couldn't do. And I remember walking out of that building on 229 West 43rd Street and thinking, What my father really gave me was freedom. So the consequences of it. I just finished that story about my dad. When my dad found out that there was no gay and lesbian organization at Colgate, he brought the gay speakers to my campus, and so I would have to sit around in groups. One of the most deeply committed heterosexuals at Colgate, building sort of sensitivity to other ways of being and sexual orientation, and this. Led eventually to gays and lesbians confiding to my father that they were uncomfortable publicly coming out of the closet and forming an organization. That was a problem that my dad solved by driving down to Colgate one day and taking me to lunch and telling me that I had to found the gay and lesbian organization. So I founded the Gay and Lesbian Alliance at Colgate. It had my name every week where it met. I never went, and I used to go into the dining hall, and the guy would take my card to check it off for breakfast, lunch, or dinner and hand it back to me and go, "Faggot." I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend. And I think that, I'm not sure how we got off on this digression, but I think that, I've lived in disintegrating societies. I've seen it. I was in Serbia and, or Sarajevo. And when the cost of standing up as things get bad is almost a willful act of suicide. And I think that the powers that be have effectively manipulated fear. I think people are afraid. People are frightened. There's that great fear leads to paralysis, as Dante understood. And I think we're afraid. And I think that, should we suffer when we suffer another terrorist attack, I think we're probably one or two terrorist attacks away from a police state.
The next question for Chris Hedges asked for his description of the Democratic Party's position on the Iraq War and why he won't be voting for the Democratic candidate for president in the coming election.
Yeah, I said on KBOO that I wasn't going to vote for Barack Obama. I'm going to vote for Ralph Nader. And why? Because we have no right to debate the terms of the occupation in Iraq. It is illegal under international law. Under post-Nuremberg laws, it is defined as a criminal war of aggression. War is not an abstraction for me. War is real. I cannot, in good conscience, go back to the Middle East. I have friends in Gaza. I have friends in Baghdad. I have friends in Jerusalem, friends in Tehran. I cannot say that I didn't do everything in my power to stop war. And the Democratic Party just voted, as you know, another authorization to fund a war. What the Bush administration has been so successful at is destroying that delicate international network of law, international treaties, Kyoto, anti-ballistic, Geneva Convention. It doesn't matter. But a rule-based world matters a lot. And if we don't recover it, we're doomed. And one of the things that angers me about progressives and liberals is that they have lost their sense of outrage and lost their sense of militancy. And until we are willing to be militant and have moral imperatives, moral lines that we will not allow people to cross, and the war is one of them. Healthcare, the death penalty, FISA, the military-industrial complex, which the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, treats as sacrosanct, the military-industrial complex is hollowing us out from the inside. It's destroying us. We have created an American oligarchy. Courtesy, the Clintons have been as rapacious and venal about this as the Republicans when they were in power. And until we don't have a lot of time left, we don't. And you cannot sustain a democratic state in an oligarchic system. It's something Plutarch and Thucydides understood. The rise of the corporate state, the turning over of the mechanisms of government to corporations is a coup d'etat in slow motion, because the only instrument that we as citizens have to protect and promote our interests, whether that's regulatory agencies, whether that's to make sure that our water is clean and our food is not contaminated and our schools are adequate, comes from the government. And when it's taken from us, as it has been, we are completely disempowered. 4 major corporations control almost all of the information we get. Viacom, GE, News Corp. And, go back and read what happened in the disintegrating societies, whether, that's Nazi Germany, whether it's in the early years of the rise of the ethnic nationalists in Yugoslavia, and you see that people have within their country an emotional or psychological incapacity to understand what's happening to them. So that if you interviewed in the cafe society of Sarajevo on the eve of the war, they would all assure you you'd never go to war. Yeah, I saw the same thing in Pristina in Kosovo with my Kosovar Albanian friends. They would say the Kosovo Liberation Army doesn't exist. I would say I was stopped by KLA, uniformed KLA members 10 kilometers outside of Pristina. Oh no, they're Serb policemen dressed up. They had no idea what was happening to them until they were literally herded out of their apartments, pushed onto boxcars on trains, and driven to Macedonia to become refugees. That psychological incapacity coupled with fear is destroying our country, because the vast majority of Americans don't want this. They don't. But until they find the courage to stand up, and look, watch every day Barack Obama. He came out today, he supported the Supreme Court decision for people to carry handguns. He announced he supported the death penalty. He's signing the FISA bill. How many times do you want him to wipe his feet all over you before you stand up and fight back? The same thing happened with Kerry. The anti-war movement was building significant resistance to the war in the streets, and to support John Kerry, they called a moratorium on the demonstrations. And what happened? Kerry talked about how he wouldn't have pulled the troops out of Fallujah. He talked about victory in Iraq. He talked about increasing troop levels, and at that point everybody should have gone back out on the street. There are moral imperatives that matter more than political expediency. And that's why I think the great figures of resistance often come from the religious left. People like Daniel Berrigan, 87 years old. I just had dinner with him a few weeks ago. I asked him about the elections, what he thought. He said, I don't follow it. If voting was that effective, it would be illegal. William Sloane Coffin, a great friend. There are moral imperatives that we must not allow people to cross, however attractive a figure Barack Obama may be. And I think that we are watching those moral imperatives being taken from us. And we have an option. It may be a protest vote. It may be futile. But it's where I'm going. That's what I'm doing.
The next question asked about U.S. plans, or possibly Israeli plans, to attack Iran. Can you comment on the likelihood of an attack on Iran prior to the end of the Bush administration?
Well, I just did an event at Town Hall with Cy Hirsch and Jeremy Scahill, which spent a lot of time on this topic. The removal of Admiral Fallon as the head of CENTCOM was a disastrous development. He was perhaps the firewall against an attack on Iran. It's very clear that they are moving to make an attack possible. I have a friend of mine who's a retired CIA agent who told me after you referred, and I don't know if you know, but the Israelis carried out a 900-mile mock mission over the Mediterranean towards Greece to simulate a long-term bombing raid with 100 warplanes and support helicopters to get down pilots and refueling planes. And he told me that in the 80s, late 80s, they had done an internal secret assessment over what it would take in terms of air power to hit Iran. It was precisely that number of 100 planes. So the possibility of a strike on Iran is very, very real. As somebody who comes out of the region, I'm just beside myself, because this would trigger a regional war. It would be interpreted by Shiites throughout the war as an attack on Shiism. 2 million Shiites in Saudi Arabia, Bahraini is Shia, huge Shiite minority in Pakistan, Iraqi, of course, is Shia. Iran doesn't have the capacity to hit the United States with conventional weapons. It does have the capacity to decimate U.S. installations in Iraq, including the Green Zone, with tremendous loss of life. It can interdict and make extremely hazardous the shipping of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil supply, as well as the oil installations on the Saudi coast. It would resurrect Hezbollah, a Shiite organization, against Israel. It would certainly hit Israel, potentially hit Israel. I'm not going to pretend that I'm in the minds of the Iranians, but if Israel got hit, it would hit back again. I mean, the way this thing could unravel, oil would double or triple instantly, which is why I think they won't do it until after the election, no matter who gets in. I don't know what to do. I did an event in New York with the Iranian ambassador to the UN denouncing the war. I wrote an article for The Nation saying if we go to war with Iran, I won't pay my income taxes. I may go to Iran to write a story. I'm a little, for The Nation. I'm terrified.
The next question for Chris Hedges asked about the future of the Status of Forces Agreement that the Bush administration is trying to get approved by the Iraqi parliament.
Yeah, the Status of Forces Agreement is to essentially legalize permanent bases in Iraq. I mean, it's pretty transparent. They have a lot of mechanisms of pressure on a very weak government. So let me get one more. Okay, from someone who didn't ask a question. Yeah.
The next question for Chris Hedges asked him to share an example of the kind of information that, as an investigative journalist, it was inappropriate to include in his published reports.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Well, there's two things you have to leave out. Sometimes you learn things that security figures. I worked mostly with French intelligence. I was based in Paris. And the French are really good. I mean, they were, at the time, the only intelligence agency, I believe, that had human assets inside al-Qaeda. Yeah, I mean, I think those of us who covered al-Qaeda believed Mohammed Atta was gay. We never wrote it. But I think that, anecdotally, his fear and inability to deal with women, his misogyny, his sexual repression, he had real problems with sexuality. But that I never wrote it because, you just can't, with serious journalism, you can't go there. The other thing, I'll give you an example, is you learn stuff that when I was with the French, they had broken several cells, al-Qaeda cells in France, and they would seize the computers and go through the computer records to look at what they were planning and what they were trying to do. And the head of intelligence or counterinsurgency at the Ministry of Interior told me that in almost every computer they seized, there were plans to poison public water supplies. And I said, well, what can you do to stop it? And he said, nothing, and that's why you can't write about it. So that kind of stuff. All right. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to independent journalist and author Chris Hedges talking about his latest book, co-authored with Laila Al-Arian, Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about Chris Hedges and his work, and about our many other video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to Chris Hedges' authors page at the TruthDig website and to his books. And you'll find streaming video and audio programs featuring speakers such as Jeremy Scahill, Phyllis Bennis, P. Synoth, Susan Faludi, George Bisharat, Ursula Le Guin, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.